After watching a close cousin murder his wife at the young age of 15, Richard Ramirez was in for a life of trouble. His story began in El Paso, Texas, on February 29th, 1960, to two Mexican immigrant parents. He was the youngest of their 5 children, and his father, who was a railway robber, was a violent alcoholic who was prone to fits of anger that often resulted in physical abuse towards the household. Ramirez was brought up as a Catholic, and he began smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol at the young age of 10 years old. Richard Ramirez is frequently referred to as a made psychopath as opposed to a born psychopath. He was a product of his environment and of his circumstances, which is unfortunate. But he did suffer from a schizoid personality disorder, which contributed to the indifference of the suffering of his victims. Ramirez was knocked unconscious multiple times before he had turned 6 years old, which then resulted in multiple issues: temporal lobe epilepsy, aggressivity, and hypersexuality. And these are big things that play a role in his later crimes. At age 12, Ramirez was taken under the wing of his older cousin, Miguel Mike Valles, a soldier of the U.S. Army who himself had become a serial killer and a rapist during his service in the Vietnam War. Valles often boasted of committing gruesome war crimes in Vietnam and shared Polaroid photos with Ramirez, showing Vietnam women who he had raped, murdered, and dismembered or decapitated. It is alleged that many of these photos depicted women being tied to trees or wooden posts, both before and after they were sexually assaulted and killed by Valles. Ramirez later stated that while incarcerated, that he was fascinated rather than repulsed by the images and stories his uncle shared with him. Valles had taught Ramirez some of his military skills, including stealth and kill tactics, and around this time, Ramirez began to seek escape from his father's violent temper by sleeping in a local cemetery. His father had often tied him to a crucifix in the cemetery as a punishment overnight. Shortly after Ramirez had turned 14 in 1974, he began using LSD frequently. He and his uncle resumed bonding over their shared use of drugs and alcohol, and it was during this time period that Ramirez began to cultivate an interest in Satanism and the occult. As a teenager, he had frequently hunted coyotes, rabbits, and birds with his father's rifle in the El Paso desert at night. He often disemboweled these animals and fed the remains to the family dog. While still in school, he began a job at the Holiday Inn, and he used his master key to steal from the patrons of the hotel. On at least one occasion, Ramirez had molested 2 children in an elevator at this hotel, but he was never reported or prosecuted for this act, and his employment ended abruptly after Ramirez attempted to rape a woman in her hotel room and was caught in the act by the victim's husband. Although the husband beat Ramirez at the scene, criminal charges were dropped when the couple who lived out of state declined to return to Texas to testify against him. At the age of 15, Ramirez was present on May 4th, 1975, when Valles fatally shot his second wife, Jessie, in the face with a handgun during a domestic argument. Like the graphic photos and stories of his cousin's war crimes in Vietnam, Ramirez later remarked similarly that witnessing the murder was not traumatic for him in any traditional sense, but rather a subject of fascination. And after the shooting, Ramirez became sullen and withdrawn from his family and peers and began increasingly committing burglaries and getting high. His uncle was found not guilty of Jesse's murder by reason of insanity, the shooting attributed to his PTSD from his military service. And Ramirez dropped out of his high school in the 9th grade shortly before the school year ended in 1977. Former teachers and classmates from Jefferson High later reported that Ramirez was essentially a troublemaker, known for his truancy, and that he was bullied by other students. Shortly after the shooting, Ramirez moved in with his older sister Ruth and her husband Roberto, an obsessive peeping Tom who took Ramirez along on his nocturnal exploits. He was just surrounded by a bunch of freaks, dude. Alcoholic dad, rapist uncle, rapist serial killer uncle who shot his wife in front of him. And now we're living with Roberto, who's the peeping Tom. He didn't even have a chance. After his uncle was released from the mental hospital in 1977, he sometimes accompanied Ramirez and Roberto on these voyeuristic walks, spying on women in the nearby areas through their windows. In 1982, at age 22, he moved to and settled permanently in California. It was around this time that Ramirez began to use cocaine, which quickly became his substance of choice, and began to commit theft and burglaries to procure money for sustaining his addiction. He lived nomadically between San Francisco and Los Angeles County during this time, prior to his incarceration. On April 10th, 1984, Ramirez murdered Mi Leung, a 9-year-old girl, in the basement of her apartment building in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Leung was with her 8-year-old brother and looking for a $1 bill when Ramirez approached the girl and told her to follow him into the basement to find it. Once they were in the basement, Ramirez beat, strangled, and Leung before stabbing her to death with the switchblade, hanging her partially nude body from a pipe by her blouse. That last part reminds me of BTK with the youngest Otero's sister, how he hung her from a pipe in her basement. These people are disgusting. The killing was not linked to Ramirez until 2009, when his DNA was matched to a sample obtained at the crime scene. 2 months after the murder of Leung, Ramirez initiated a series of violent home invasions that sparked a moral panic in Los Angeles and later San Francisco. He began with a lone June 1984 attack before emerging in March 1985 and continuing his spree throughout the summer, leading to one of the largest police manhunts in California history. Fun fact, Richard Ramirez was not the only Night Stalker. The one before him, his crimes were 1979 to 1981. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. He's the original Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez just came after him, and he kind of overshadowed Joseph D'Angelo. On June 28, 1984, 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was found murdered in her apartment in Glacel Park, Los Angeles. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the head, neck, and chest while asleep in her bed, and her throat slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. This, his second known murder, established his pattern of committing particularly vicious crimes, and frequently burglarizing the homes of his victims before or after killing them, which was mainly to support his drug addiction and pay his rent. Get a fucking job. Get a job. You can sustain yourself that way. You don't need to kill and rape innocent women. 9 months later, on March 17th, 1985, Ramirez attacked 22-year-old Maria Hernandez outside her home in Rosemead, shooting her in the face with a .22 caliber handgun after she pulled into her garage. She survived when the bullet ricocheted off the keys she held in her hands as she lifted them to protect herself. Hernandez played dead until Ramirez left the scene, and inside the house, her roommate, 34-year-old Daiyashi Okazaki, heard the gunshot and ducked behind a counter when she saw Ramirez enter the kitchen. When she raised her head to get a look at what had happened, Ramirez, who was waiting for Okazaki to peek over the counter, shot her once in the forehead, killing her instantly. Within an hour of the Rosemead attack, Ramirez pulled 30-year-old Cy Leon Veronica Yu out of her car in Monterey Park, shot her twice with a .22 caliber handgun, and fled. She was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. The two murders and an attempted third in a single day attracted extensive coverage from the news media, who dubbed the attacker, described as curly-haired with bulging eyes and wide-spaced rotting teeth, the walking killer and the valley intruder. 1 week later, at approximately 2 a.m. on March 27th, 1985, Ramirez entered a home that he had burglarized a year earlier, just outside of Whittier, and killed 64-year-old Vincent Charles Zazara in his sleep with a gunshot to his head. Zazara's wife, 44-year-old Maxine Lavinia Zazara, was awakened by the gunshot. Ramirez beat her and bound her hands while demanding to know where her valuables are. Whilst he ransacked the room, Maxine escaped her bonds and retrieved a shotgun from under the bed, which she was unaware was not loaded. She pulled the trigger just after he turned around and saw her. The infuriated Ramirez shot her 3 times with his handgun, killing her, then fetched a large carving knife from the kitchen. He mutilated her body by cutting an inverted cross, into her chest, and then removed her eyes and placed them inside of a jewelry box. He attempted to have sex with her body, but found himself so shaken by her attempting to shoot him that he could not get it up. He couldn't get hard. He took the jewelry box containing this poor woman's eyes and kept it at his apartment as a souvenir until his arrest. By the way, just a silly little, not so silly fun fact. He listened to Two Eyes Without a Face by Billy Idol during all this, like when he got back to his apartment. Every time that song comes on now, I can't listen to it. So all I can think about is Ramirez and the eyes in his jewelry box. It's so morbid. Ramirez had left footprints from a pair of AVS sneakers in the flower beds, which the police photographed and cast. On May 14th, 1985, Ramirez returned to Monterey Park and entered the home of 66-year-old Bill Doy and his disabled wife, 56-year-old Lillian Doy. Surprising Doy in his bedroom, Ramirez had shot him in the face with a .22 semi-automatic pistol as Doy went for his own handgun. After beating Bill unconscious, Ramirez entered Lillian's bedroom, bound her with thumb cuffs, then raped her after he had ransacked the home for valuables. Bill died of his injuries while in the hospital. 2 weeks later, on May 29th, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Monrovia and stopped at the house of Mabel Ma Bell, aged 83, and her disabled sister, 81-year-old Florence Nettie Lang. Finding a hammer in the kitchen, he bludgeoned and bound Lang in her bedroom, and then bound and bludgeoned Bell before using an electrical cord to shock the woman. After raping Lang, he used Bell's lipstick to draw the satanic pentagram symbol on her thigh as well as on the walls of both bedrooms. The women were found 2 days later alive but comatose and critically injured. Bell died in the hospital from her injuries on July 15th, and Lang died in August. The next day, Ramirez drove the same car to Burbank and snuck into the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. At gunpoint, he bound Kyle and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs. Before ransacking the house, he released Kyle to direct him to where the family's valuables were, and he then raped her repeatedly. Ramirez repeatedly ordered her not to look at him, telling her at one point that he would cut her eyes out. He fled the scene after retrieving the child from the closet and binding the two together, again with the handcuffs. On the night of July 2nd, 1985, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Arcadia and randomly selected the house of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon, a widowed grandmother. After quietly entering Cannon's home, he found her asleep in her bedroom. He bludgeoned her into unconsciousness with a lamp and stabbed her to death using a 10-inch butcher knife from her kitchen. 3 nights later, Ramirez had broken into a home and bludgeoned 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron as she slept in her bedroom. After searching in vain for a knife in the kitchen, Ramirez tried to strangle the girl with a telephone cord. He stated that he was startled to see electrical sparks emanate from the cord, and when his victim began to breathe, he fled the house, believing that Jesus Christ had intervened to save her. Bennett survived the attack, although 478 stitches were required to close the lacerations to her scalp. What the fuck? I think that people like this should actually be like publicly fucking hung. Hung and celebrated, dude. On July 7th, Ramirez burglarized the home of 60-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson in Monterey Park. Finding her asleep on her living room couch, he beat her to death by stomping on her face repeatedly. A shoe print from an AVS sneaker was left imprinted onto her face, and after cruising 2 other neighborhoods, he returned to Monterey Park and chose the home of Sophie Dickman, aged 63. Ramirez assaulted and handcuffed her at gunpoint, attempted to rape her, and stole her jewelry. When she swore to him that he had taken everything of value, he told her to swear on Satan. 2 weeks later, on July 20th, Ramirez purchased a machete before driving a stolen Toyota to Glendale. He chose the home of 66-year-old Leah Needing and her husband, 68-year-old Maxon Needing. He burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom and hacked them with the machete and then killed them with shots to the head from a .22 caliber handgun. He further mutilated their bodies with the machete before robbing the house of valuables. After quickly fencing the stolen items, Ramirez drove to Sun Valley, Los Angeles, and he broke into the home of the Cahavanith family. He then terrorized this family and then forced the wife to show him where the valuables were, which he then stole. On August 6th, 1985, Ramirez had drove to Northridge and broke into the home of 30-year-old Chris Peterson and Virginia Peterson, aged 27. He crept into the bedroom, startled Virginia, and shot her in the face with a .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun. He shot Chris in the neck and attempted to flee. Chris had fought back while avoiding being hit by 2 more shots during the struggle before Ramirez managed to escape. Both of them survived their injuries. 2 nights later, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Diamond Bar and chose the home of Sakina Applewath, age 27, and her husband, 35-year-old Elias Abawath. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., he entered the house and went into the master bedroom. He instantly killed the sleeping Elias with a shot to the head from a .25 caliber handgun. He handcuffed and beat Sakina while forcing her to reveal the locations of the family's jewelry and then brutally raped her. He repeatedly demanded that she swear on Satan that she would not scream during any of his assaults, and when the couple's 3-year-old son entered the bedroom, Ramirez tied the child up and continued to rape Sakina. After he left the house, Sakina untied her son and sent him to the neighbors for help. Ramirez, who had closely been following the coverage of this crime, left Los Angeles and headed to San Francisco. On August 18th, he entered the home of 66-year-old Peter Pan and 62-year-old Barbara Pan. He shot sleeping Peter in the temple with a .25 caliber handgun, killing him instantly. He beat and sexually assaulted Barbara before shooting her in the head and leaving her for dead, though she ultimately survived her injuries. At the crime scene, Ramirez used lipstick to scrawl a pentagram and the phrase "Jack the Knife" on the bedroom wall. He again left a shoe print at the scene that detectives discovered and matched to a specific pair of Avia shoes that was not common at that time. On August 24th, 1985, Ramirez traveled 76 miles south of Los Angeles. He arrived at the home of 45-year-old James Romero Jr., but Romero's son, 13-year-old James Romero III, was awake, and while his family was asleep, James went outside of his house to retrieve a pillow inside a truck, which was locked. Ramirez had tried to break into the home of James Romero Jr., however, it was not successful, and his car was actually reported and the car was stolen. He aborts the attack on the Romero residence, and Ramirez broke into the home of 30-year-old Bill Carnes and his fiancée, 29-year-old Inez Erickson, through a back door. Ramirez went into their bedroom and awakened Carnes when he cocked his .25 caliber handgun. He shot him 3 times in the head before turning his attention to Erickson. Ramirez had told her that he was the Night Stalker and forced her to swear she loved Satan as he beat her with his fists and bound her with neckties from the closet. After stealing what he could find, Ramirez dragged Erickson to another room before raping her brutally. He had demanded cash and jewelry, anything that he could get his hands on to sustain his drug addiction. Before leaving the home, he had told the woman to tell the police that the Night Stalker was here. Erickson had untied herself and went to a neighbor's house for help. Surgeons removed 2 of the 3 bullets from Carnes' head, and he survived the injuries. They were able to find Ramirez because of his shoes, as there were only 6 in the size 11.5, and 1 pair was shipped to California, and the police then put it together that that pair of shoes was sold to the perpetrator, the Night Stalker, and that was a big reason why they were able to find and capture Ramirez. However, Ramirez did drop his sneakers over the Golden Gate Bridge, because he was watching the police coverage of the crime scenes of them figuring out who the perpetrator was because of the shoes. So then he got rid of the shoes because he thought that was gonna work. It didn't. It didn't because Erickson survived, gave a detailed description of her abuser to the investigators, and police had obtained a cast of Ramirez's footprint from the Romero house. His stolen car, the stolen Toyota, was found abandoned on August 28th in Koreatown, Los Angeles. Police had obtained a fingerprint from the car. The print was then positively identified as belonging to Richard Ramirez, who was described by police as a 25-year-old drifter from Texas, which is true. And then they pulled him up and saw all the different charges he had on him before he started the Night Stalker bullshit. On August 29th, 1985, they released a mugshot of Ramirez to the public and then said, "We know who you are now, and soon everyone else will. There will be no place you can hide." And then he decides to go to Tucson, Arizona on a bus, but because the entire country knows what he looks like and everyone's looking for him, it doesn't go too well. He goes on this crazy chase. It's crazy, run. Where are you going? Anyway, he runs through all these people's homes, whatever, their backyards. We're in a movie, but obviously they take him on this little chase to God only knows where he thought he was going. 10 residents had tied him, not tied him down, but beaten him I need this sickness has gotta go away because it's fucking up all my words. Dude, it's fucking up all my words. They restrain him, and then the police show up and they have their fucking killer. Ramirez thought he was that guy because his first court appearance, mind you, he raised a hand with a little pentagram drawn on it and yelled, "Hail Satan." It just went right over his head. On September 20th, 1989, Ramirez was convicted of all 43 charges, 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. During the penalty phase of the trial on November 7th, 1989, he was sentenced to death in California's gas chamber. I love to hear it. I love to hear it. He stated to reporters after the death sentence, saying, "Big deal, death always went with the territory, see you in Disneyland." You're not in Disneyland. You are rotting in hell. I talked about this in a last video about hyperstophilia, and women, were writing him letters and paying him visits. Beginning in 1985, Doreen Leoy wrote Ramirez nearly 75 letters during his incarceration. In 1988, he proposed to her, and on October 3rd, 1996, they were married in California's San Quentin State Prison. For many years before Ramirez's death, Leoy stated that she would commit suicide when Ramirez was executed. But something happened with her family, and she kind of figured out that this guy was a piece of shit. I support women, but some of you guys are really stupid, okay? On August 7th, 2006, Ramirez's first round of state appeals ended unsuccessfully when the California Supreme Court upheld his convictions and death sentence. On September 7th, 2006, the California Supreme Court denied his request for a rehearing. Ramirez had additional appeals pending until the time of his death. He was not killed by the death penalty. He was not killed by the gas chamber. He died on June 7th, 2013, at age 53. He had been affected by chronic substance abuse and chronic hepatitis C viral infection, whatever that means. His body was not claimed, so it was cremated. Fun fact, I already said Joseph D'Angelo, he was the original Night Stalker. However, there was another Night Stalker in London. He was a serial rapist in the 1990s and 2000s. He was then named by the British media because they can't come up with anything original. They have to take it from us. Well, my laptop died just now. I think I was in the middle of talking about British people. I think I was shitting on them. I'm gonna go and I'm not gonna say another word for the rest of the day because my throat is killing me. The amount of pauses I had to take to cough my lungs out recording this. There was even a moment where I was like, I'm not doing this. I'm not gonna record this. And my subscribers just gonna have to deal. But because I love you all and I want to put out semi-decent content, why is it glitching? I persevered. I powered through it. Anyway, I love you guys very much. Subscribe, like, comment. And I'll see you in my next freaking video. Peace out and goodbye.